the third discussion for today, where our distinguished speakers will share their insight and perspective on today's topic. Without any further ado, let's begin our next panel session. We will immediately resume our proceedings with our third panel discussion, focusing on the Code of Conduct and its implication for the award. It is my pleasure to invite our moderator, Mr. Adityo Kusumawardono. Professor, please take the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and allow me to welcome to all of you, all the distinguished speaker and participant to this seminar. And first of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Adityo Kusumawardono. I'm a lecturer from Faculty of Law, Universitas Pancasila, and I will be the moderator from the panel 3. And also, before we begin, I have to introduce to our panelists. We have Professor Nengye. He's the Associate Professor of Law from Singapore Management University. And then the second panelist is Dr. Nguyen, Huong. She's a Director Center for International Law of the EC Institute. And then the third panelist is Mr. Neil S. Silva. He's a Legal Officer, University of the Philippine Law Center, Institute for the Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. And then the last one is our discussion, Professor Kitty Prasitsuk. He's a Professor of International Relations from Thammasat University, Thailand. So without further ado, I would like to invite the committee. May I know the Professor Liu Nengye? Okay, Professor Liu Nengye, please, the floor is yours to present the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chair. And first, I would like to thank the organizer, especially Professor Ari Afsiria. Where is he? After lunch, I would like to thank him in particular for organizing this wonderful conference and for having me here. So, this morning when I was heading down from Singapore to Jakarta, I was like, wow, now as a very normal academic, it's part of the history. Because today it marks indeed a history in the law of the sea. So my talk today is going to focus on the South China Sea Code of Conduct, but I have to admit that I really haven't had any insights about the negotiation. I know the negotiation is going on. Now I think delegations from various ASEAN countries and China, they are meeting, it seems that they are meeting monthly now to try to get it done. But as an academic, I don't really have any insight about what's going on regarding those provisions of the COC. But I guess this also gives me a lot of freedom to really express my own vision about, as an academic who has been doing research on the law of the sea for the past 20 years, like what I would like to have if we can get a COC done in the South China Sea, and what I don't like the COC to be in the near future. So next slide, please. So as you can see that, the world has changed a lot over the past decade. I must say, when the South China Sea Arbitral Award was delivered, I was really shocked. I was shocked in a way because it was so tense in those days in the media narrative that I still recall very vividly. But these days, after 10 years, compared to other parts of the world, I think we are doing well. The Strait of Malacca is still free and open. There is no military, major war in the Southeast Asia. And, compared to other parts of the world, be it, Strait of Hormuz or Ukraine or, some other parts, I think we are doing well. So I would like to really congratulate ASEAN for achieving the peace in the region so far. So next slide, please. So when the Arbitral Award was delivered, that's when I also just arrived at Australia. So now I'm based in Singapore, but I was teaching law of the sea in Australia. So that's when I just arrived at Australia. So in 2 weeks' time, I organized a conference trying to find solutions. And in those days, I was proposing, and I think it's still valid, but now I have get a better idea, is I would propose we try to develop South China Sea as a condominium. But of course, in those days, I didn't know that condominium is a very common kind of a property type in Singapore. So, you have HDBs, you have condominium, and you have landed, right? So that's what I didn't know. But I think the idea is still valid these days. And taking this is if you have been to Singapore, you should know this very old private residential condominium in Tanjung Ru. That condominium pretty much is like a type of private residential property consisting of a collection of individually owned apartment units housed in an entire development. So condos are very known for their in-house communal facilities. So basically, my proposal in those days was like, we can just build up the South China Sea as a condominium. We all have our claims as a coastal state, but at the same time, just take South China Sea as a big swimming pool. That's kind of like my idea. And I think there are certain, I would say, benefits for making this idea happen. That it can, in a condominium, 2 or more states, they can exercise joint sovereignty over territory. Countries in this tendency in common, they can have unequal shares. Not all countries, they don't need to have equal shares. They can have unequal shares. But of course, you also have the right to the possession of the whole property, and also the property, the South China Sea in this case, has no exclusive possession to any party. This idea also has been practiced in the history. On many occasions, unfortunately, it was kind of like a colonial practice, because especially happened when the Europeans were colonizing the whole world, and then some legacy issues, and then certain countries, they come together and exercise joint sovereignty. But it could also be a very good way for dispute settlement. And next slide, please. And I think in the context of the law of the sea, and I think the UNCLOS actually provides a very good legal basis for a condominium. So we have all sorts of articles in the UNCLOS that touched upon shared fish stocks, cooperation in the coordination, management, conservation, exploration of marine living resources. And in recent years, I think the states, it has been reaffirmed by the ITLOS advisory opinion that states, they do have general obligations to protect marine environment and also take measures to prevent, reduce, and control pollution. Next slide, please. And this has also been practiced in this part of the world. I'm sure that my Indonesian colleagues are very familiar with this. I just came across it recently, that this MOU 74 box between Australia and Indonesia around the Australian EEZ of the Ashmore and the Cartier Islands, which offers Indonesian fishermen the traditional fishing rights. So this is something I think my idea has evolved over the past 10 years. This is something I would like to see for the South China Sea Code of Conduct, is a condominium that is underpinned by the UNCLOS. That's what I want to see. Whether this can be achieved, I don't know. Next slide, please. So, of course, to kind of like further add to my point, a regional condominium that is underpinned by the UNCLOS. I don't mean UNCLOS in a static way. Of course, UNCLOS, according to itself, is not a static convention. It can be developed. There are certain driving forces, geopolitical shifts, new technology, climate change, as we have actually seen in recent years. We have the BBNJ agreement, which is an implementing agreement of the UNCLOS. We have ITLOS advisory opinion, which clarifies countries' obligation to combat climate change. So, these developments are inevitable to deal with new challenges, but it doesn't mean that we should abandon UNCLOS or just take UNCLOS as one source of international law. Next slide, please. So that's what I would like to see. And if that is not entirely possible, a regional COC underpinned by the UNCLOS, then the second option, which is also good, because I have done a lot of research in this area, which happened in Antarctica. the Antarctic Treaty System. So the Antarctic Treaty System is also very unique in international law in a sense that, there are 7 original claimants of the Antarctic continent. As you can see, it is also those claims are also the colonial legacy. So it came out of at the beginning of 20th century, this so-called heroic age that all these European settlers, they tried to explore different parts of the world, and they ended up with this kind of a slice of pies claims from UK, France, Australia, Chile, Argentina, and Norway. But the Antarctic Treaty, which was adopted and also as a compromise between the United States and Soviet Union in 1958 in this Cold War, pretty much leave those claims aside. So those claims were not rejected, but they were not supported. Instead, the continent, based on the Antarctic Treaty and its subsequent development of different kinds of instruments, has turned the Antarctica and also its adjacent waters into a zone of peace and science cooperation. Now we have like about 50 countries in this club. But of course, I have to remind you that the Antarctic Treaty System is unique because the Antarctic Treaty was adopted in 1958, so it was before UNCLOS. That's why the interaction between UNCLOS and the Antarctic Treaty System is a bit kind of like interesting and also unique. Next slide, please. What I don't like the South China COC to become is something that is drifting away from the UNCLOS. So I really have to remind my dear colleagues here in this room. So I have noticed this morning, and this has people talking about upholding a rules-based order. For example, this is a very popular word. But I would like to really remind you that this rules-based order is an invention by UK and American think tank. Of course, the invention carries different dimensions. Rules-based order. It carries a dimension that, there are certain rules defenders and rules breakers. So it's pretty much to attack the rules breakers and as the defender, right? But then there is another dimension, which is the order. And the order, which is not mentioned in the wording, has a hidden power structure. So whoever is the most powerful, it's possible for them to determine the order. And once there is an order, then the rules come after it. So in my opinion, the rules-based, so we should be very careful about using, just whatever, blindly, let's just uphold rules-based international order. Because in my view, rules-based international order is a neutral term. It is used in the Western media and in the English media with certain hidden kind of like ways. For example, it is a US anchored rules-based order. But rules-based order itself can really become a reality in different parts of the world. So that is something I think what I read about the South China Sea Code of Conduct, that from the latest interview by Straits Times with the Filipino Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Lazaro said there are like 4 core issues that remain unsolved: whether the agreement will be legally binding or not, what is the Code of Conduct's geographic scope, what is the connection between COC and the 2002 declaration, and finally the terms of reference. I think maybe this is hidden, maybe the negotiators, they are aware of this, but if it's not, I think that another issue that really needs to get attention is the relationship between COC and UNCLOS. That should be made very clear in the negotiation. Otherwise, that might become, because if the COC become legally binding, and in the current international law, it is actually quite fragmented, So that could a legally binding COC could really become a parallel legal instrument together with the UNCLOS. So I think that's something I read about the COC negotiation that I think that should be really mindful for all countries involved. So that's pretty much. So I haven't talked about US, but I think I will just leave it. I think the cartoon, the picture speaks 1,000 words. What it means, the rules-based order. It all started from Monroe Doctrine in Latin America. That's what it starts. This is a vivid reflection of the rules-based order. So that's what I'm trying to say. Don't just blindly say, let's uphold the rule-based international order. There should be some awareness and some also caveats in that kind of process. And I think that's all my slides. Next, please. Thank you.
All right. Next, our second participant. Second panelist, Dr. Nguyen T. Lan Huong. Dr. T. Lan Huong, the floor is yours.
It's fine. Okay, distinguished speakers and delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon. First of all, I would like to express my very sincere thanks to the organizer for inviting me to the workshop. And what I am about to share reflect my own personal perspective on the topic of the session. And from my personal viewpoint, the COC is a challenging topic because as I do agree with Prof. Liu, because from the scholar perspective, it's very hard to find what is going on in the negotiation. Ladies and gentlemen, to begin, I would like to first briefly review some of the key milestones of the COC negotiation. And in fact, we can easily find this information in public available sources. As we know that the need of establishing a code of international conduct over the South China Sea is not new, and it was first highlighted in the 1992 ASEAN Declarations on the South China Sea, and since then it forced to develop a framework to promote a peaceful and stable environment in the South China Sea have continued over several decades. And in 2002, ASEAN and China issued the DOC, and in 2011, the guidelines for the implementation of the DOC were subsequently agreed. And since March 2018, ASEAN and China are engaged in the negotiation of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. And in 2023, under the Indonesia chairmanship in ASEAN, the guidelines for accelerating the early conclusion of an effective and substantive code of conduct in the South China Sea were officially adopted. And since then, we can see that the process of the negotiation remains ongoing with effort. And as we know that now the third reading of the single draft of COC negotiating takes completed. And if we look in the several ASEAN statements, for example, in the ASEAN retreat statement from the beginning of this year, we can see that ASEAN highlight that ASEAN endeavor to conclude the negotiation of the effective and substantive COC that is in accordance with international law, particularly the 1982 UNCLOS within this year. And I think this statement, the wording in ASEAN statement show the clear consensus on the desired outcome of this COC, effective, substantive, and in accordance with the international law, particularly the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I think this very linked to the question raised by Prof. Liu that you want that the desire of COC should highlight the relations between the COC and the UNCLOS. And I think for the ASEAN and China, the element of in accordance with the international law, particularly UNCLOS, is significant because now China and all the ASEAN states are the member of the UNCLOS since the Cambodia official ratify UNCLOS in February 2026. So as we know from the beginning of this morning, I learned that we agree that the UNCLOS provide a legal framework governing all the activity at sea. For example, the UNCLOS defining the limit of maritime entitlement. The UNCLOS provide for the rights and obligation of the member state, including the coastal state and landlocked state. And the UNCLOS provide for the international and relation cooperation in enclosed sea and semi-enclosed sea. And one of the greatest achievement under the UNCLOS is the mechanism of dispute, settlement of dispute, with a number of platforms like arbitration under the Annex 7 or special arbitration under the Annex 8 or conciliation under the Annex 5 or and two international court like ICJ and ITLOS. And if we look at the ASEAN statement, we can see that the wording from the ASEAN countries, like they highlight the universal and the unified character of the UNCLOS. Like UNCLOS provides the legal framework within which all activity in the ocean and sea must be carried out. And the ASEAN has shared commitment to the peaceful resolution of the dispute, including full respect for legal and diplomatic processes without resorting to the threat or use of force in accordance with international law, including UNCLOS. This is a statement, chairman's statement last year. And the second element in the outcome design for the COC, the future COC, I think that the element of effective and substantive. And this raises the question that if the future COC would differ from or have a more substantive content than the DOC 2002, if we look into the DOC, we can see that this is until now is still the milestone document between the ASEAN and China to China dialogue relation. And in DOC, there are a number of collective commitments of the party to promote peace, stability, mutual trust, confidence in the region in accordance with international law, and including UNCLOS. And DOC reflect the commitment to the principle of international law, or exploring ways for building trust and confidence, respect of freedom of navigation and overfly, undertake to resolve dispute by peaceful means, or explore ways for cooperative activities in different areas. However, the DOC in person likes a complete mechanism to monitoring or enforce compliance. Even in 2011, like I mentioned before, that ASEAN and China has a guideline for the implementation, but it lacks a firm mechanism to ensure the compliance of the DOC. So therefore, I think for the COC, a future and desired COC, it should include maybe the mechanism for how to effectively implementation of the COC. Before my conclusions, this morning I learned from the presentation by Prof. Ari. He is not here, but I think in his presentation he suggested a realistic approach to a substantive COC, and among these points, I do share some viewpoint to agree with him. For example, he mentioned for the COC, the UNCLOS must be the anchor, and I think that the future COC must be consistent with the UNCLOS, and the COC cannot be treated as a substitute for the UNCLOS. And the second suggestion I do agree with Prof area is a no prejudice clause. I mean that COC do not affect any legal positions among the parties. And for the third point that Professor Area mentioned is the review mechanism. I do agree maybe it's a kind of mechanism the negotiator may think about it, or I think maybe in the future COC maybe have some mechanism, effective mechanism to monitor and ensure it complement. So last but not least, I would like to add one thing is the good faith is very important. Good faith is not only in implementation or good faith is interpretation of the international treaty, particularly UNCLOS. Thank you very much. I would like to stop my presentation here, and I am very open to any question and comment later. Thank you.
So thank you for the presentation, Dr. Nguyen, and also Professor Liu. And next we are moving into our third panelist, Mr. Neil Silva. Mr. Neil Silva, the floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak before you today. I would like to note that we are celebrating 3 milestones. First of all, of course, is, as noted, the 10th anniversary of the issuance of the Merits Award in the South China Sea arbitration. The second, and something most forgotten by most people, is that it is actually very near to the anniversary of the approval of the first voyage of Admiral Zheng He on I believe it was July 11, I think 1405, I'm not sure anymore, under, at that time, the Ming Dynasty, Mingguo. And the third is that we are also celebrating the anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, 1976. I would like to note that basically these are things that we observe together because we have common interests even amid our differences. And I would like to keep that in mind. So next slide. Okay, as noted, everything I say here is entirely my own personal and private opinion. I'd like to acknowledge the assistance of our research assistants in the Institute, but I would like to note that any errors are completely and entirely my own, including the typos, especially the typos. So this very briefly, this is cut down from around 150 slides to around 10. So very briefly, divided into 4 parts. First, a very brief summary of the COC, which we all know about, but I'd like to hammer on the systemic implications as they refer to this, as they might be relevant to the COC. The second part is how does that therefore help in the COC process? That's the second part. The third is how does the COC process help the 2016 award in its implementation gradually, eventually? And finally, what are the pitfalls we need to be watchful for? And some of them have been already noted by the other speakers. So first part. Okay, next. Okay, just note that this is some of you have already seen this. This is a summary of what are the various issues and disputes in the South China Sea. Because quite frankly, we need, especially for persons who are not specialists in the field, we need to distinguish it in the fact that there are disputes over areas. That's the top circle. And then there are systemic issues of legal interpretation. That's the left bottom circle. And then there are political and security issues. That's the right bottom circle. They are related because of the same area, but they are distinct. And solving one does not mean solving the other, but it may lead to, but may have effects on the other. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so the 2016 Merits Award, as well as, I might note, the 2015 Jurisdiction Award, affected only this part, but it actually had implications for others. It had as a 9-dash line, the binding, the approval, the 2015 Merits Award has a the 2016 Jurisdiction Award has a very real effect on the normative effectiveness of UNCLOS and international law in general, especially in view of the principle competence. But also, the 2016 Merits Award has implications on the scope of the remaining territorial disputes. Next slide. So, next slide. So, how does the 2016 award assist in pursuing the COC objectives? Okay, the two awards together. Number one, the fact that they affirmed compulsory disputes resolution under the 2015 Jurisdiction Award, and the fact that 2016 award affirmed the priority of the UNCLOS conventional norm over any parallel historic customary norms, solidifies UNCLOS as the normative foundation for our maritime relationships. The fact that it basically segmented the territory, right? Basically says because there are no extraordinary or excessive maritime claims, and they're all either only rocks or low tide elevations. Basically, it limited the effect of the remaining territorial disputes, right? It basically enclaved the territorial disputes, and beyond it is clarity of the EEZ and continental shelf claims. The segmenting of the South China Sea disputes allows us to settle one, and while the others are not necessarily settled, but only managed. And also, I would like to note that the fact that 2016 Merits Award affirmed the character of the South China Sea as a semi-enclosed sea, which, without categorically saying it, would actually put it under the scope of Part 9 on cooperation on semi-enclosed seas. And finally, it affirms some of the illegality of of gray zone tactics, including dangerous maneuvers, which of course regulates the conduct of parties, even amidst our competition. So next slide. So okay, go back to the previous slide. To summarize, what it did therefore is it laid out the ground rules for continuing cooperation and competition among the parties. It laid out the ground rules. It didn't solve many of the problems. It didn't solve the disputes, but it solved the ground rules to be followed. Next slide. So, categorically, note again, as noted, because the 2016 Merits Award basically declared the pink area to be considered as a maritime claim. As you know, there is the 1940s. There's a map of the 1940s, and then there's a 2009 affirmation in the note verbals. Considered as a maritime claim, it was declared invalid. And then the rocks or low tide elevations, the rocks were deemed, since they were deemed to be rocks, they only had 12 nautical mile lines. Therefore, again, basically carving out the effect of the remaining territorial disputes, allowing us to move forward on actually having, for example, maritime delimitation talks pursuant to Article 74 and Article 83 of UNCLOS, insofar as our overlapping EEZ and continental shelf claims are concerned, including, by the way, under Article 76 extended continental shelf claim potentially. Next slide. So, how therefore might the COC, okay, we've talked about how the award benefits the COC. How would the COC benefit the award, potentially? Okay, let's recall what the result of the 2016 Merits Award are concerned. It affirmed basically coastal state entitlement to the EEZ and continental shelf by basically invalidating the excessive historic claims, right? It also affirmed the fact that the central South China Sea features are either LTEs or rocks without EEZ and continental shelf entitlement, and it noted that relevant parties violated the norms under UNCLOS, including against aggravation of disputes. Now, we need to distinguish between what are the ideal things that we want out of this versus the pragmatic things that might be acquired as a medium-term goal or as a lower-hanging fruit. What are the ideals? For relevant parties to repudiate the excessive maritime claims, to expressly acknowledge coastal state EEZ, the primacy of EEZ jurisdiction of relevant coastal states, to abandon reclaimed low tide elevations and restore them to their natural state as much as possible, and maybe even to give reparation and satisfaction for the resulting environmental damage. That's the ideal. What the pragmatic cooperation, already noted by some of the parties, is really for the relevant parties to gradually reduce enforcement of those excessive maritime claims, not only vis-a-vis the Philippines, but also vis-a-vis other coastal states, to cease activities inconsistent with coastal state jurisdiction, even without an express and frankly politically costly repudiation. To cease expanding their already existing presence in over LTEs in the relevant jurisdictional areas of coastal states, and to enter into cooperative arrangements consistent with the award and with UNCLOS, and to assist, by the way, in ecological recovery of affected habitats and species, because certain species and certain habitats may have been adversely affected by the acts which are considered in the award. So again, there's the ideal, and there's maybe the pragmatic solutions and pragmatic outcomes without necessarily an express repudiation or an express change in policies, perhaps a pragmatic and operational change in behavior, even a change in operational tempo, even a lowering of the narrative temperature may be acquired. And what is then the benefit of the COC? Quite frankly, according to the published sources, the COC will continue and reiterate the DOC's schemata for cooperative, substantive cooperation, right? And also, according to the published sources, the COC will have, for example, management of incidents. Well, management of incidents, it's aided by the fact that there might be, again, control of behavior guided by the award insofar as dangerous maneuvers are concerned. And again, the fact that the COC promotes cooperative arrangements, which is consistent with the UNCLOS Part 9 and also consistent with a pragmatic behavior change on the third column. Perhaps, again, this might be, again, a behavioral change which allow us to stabilize relations and also to gradually move to an UNCLOS compliant set of behaviors while at the same time acknowledging real differences in legal and political positions. Again, it may be a medium term, it may be a pragmatic adjustment. Next slide. So, note for example, this is one possible way forward. I presented this a few days ago at the WPS symposium in the Philippines, and for the purpose of this award, of this group, I basically recycled and modified it for an international audience. What are the things that we may do? There's a mixture of hard and soft approaches available to the claimant state of ASEAN and in the South China Sea. Assert by physical and legal means your own position. Work together, coalition, to internationalize the disputes and to persuade all relevant parties to negotiate in good faith. But on the soft side, it is for the parties to consult on the implementation of the 2016 award, to communicate to manage incidents, to negotiate lawful maritime delimitation, again under Article 74, Article 3 of UNCLOS, to manage the existing territorial disputes over islands and rocks, to conclude an acceptable code of conduct, and to socialize the elites and decision makers of various countries on the primacy of international law. Because when all is said and done, countries do not exist. What exists are individuals who are decision makers embedded in the elite networks of their different countries. How do we make it acceptable within their elite networks and within their publics to have a compromise founded on the primacy of international law over sovereignty? And also to cooperate, number one, among the claimants, number two, with other user states, because as we know, South China Sea is really global commons, to cooperate on the South China Sea as a semi-enclosed sea, to protect the environment, and to explore relevant resources in accordance with international law and the relevant domestic laws. This is a menu of possible things that may be done, both on the hard side of asserting and the soft side of cooperating and negotiating. Something that may be considered by all relevant parties in the South China Sea. Next slide. And finally, what do we mean by an acceptable COC? The fourth part, therefore, what do we need to avoid for the COC to not become prejudicial to our interests? And some of the speakers have already mentioned them. Number one, the COC ought not to preclude the use of third-party modes of dispute resolution, to stick only to negotiation and consultation, because that is inconsistent with international law, particularly the UN Charter statement on the relevant means of dispute settlement, negotiation, good office, as well as the Hague Convention 1 of 1907 and Hague Convention 1 of 1899 on the modes of dispute settlement. I would like to also mention the Manila Declaration of 1982, as well as the Pact of Bogota on what are the means of dispute settlement. It's not only limited to bilateral, but also includes multilateral. COC ought not to preclude implementation of dispute settlement modes, such as the 2016 award. It ought not to impliedly affirm norms contrary or parallel to UNCLOS provisions, as noted earlier. It ought not to, maybe I should fix this, ought not to contain provisions inconsistent with fundamental rulings of the 2015 award, such as, for example, an Article 74, Article 83 provisional arrangement, which is based on the assumption of an actual de jure overlap, among others. Okay, so why? Why ought not to avoid it? Why should it not avoid these provisions? Number one, because it might render the UNCLOS legal regime less enforceable if you weaken the enforcement mechanism under Part 15. Number two, you might end up transforming UNCLOS from a regulatory regime, a rules regime, into a programmatic cooperative regime without any real control on actual behavior. I'm using here the nomenclature of Professor Oran Yang on the kind of governance regimes. A regulatory regime actually has actual control and behavior. A programmatic regime, less so, less on expectations. It might reopen the package deal. The fact that, as noted by Dr. Tomiko, it's a long-fought package deal, which is a constitution for the oceans. We don't want to reopen something already negotiated in 1982, from 74 to 82. We might end up carving a regional lex specialis, which would weaken our own UNCLOS-based rights and duties under the treaty. And finally, it might weaken the individual norms of UNCLOS from binding norms to maybe declaratory policies or vague sets of principles. So these are the things that, from my own personal private observation, COC ought to avoid, and these are the reasons why it ought to avoid them. So to summarize, there are number one, the 2016 and 2015 awards in the South China Sea arbitration had systemic effects relevant to the COC. Number two, some of these effects are helpful for the process of the COC because, again, it clarifies the scope of disputes and allows us the ground rules for their management. Number three, the COC process itself might also be helpful to the gradual operationalization, pragmatic, if not necessarily ideal, operationalization and implementation of the 2016 and 2015 awards in the South China Sea Award. And number four, there are things we ought to make sure we do not do in the COC award so that, number one, it would not weaken the 2016 award, but also in general, the UNCLOS regime, which we negotiated at such great lengths and which benefits all of us for the global common good. Next slide. I would like to end with this quote: the work of justice is peace, and if we would like peace and security and stability in our region, let us work together for justice and law. Thank you all very much. Pax Vobiscum.
Thank you for Mr. Neil for the presentation of the third panelist, and I would like to invite all panelists into the stage, and then including Professor Kitty as a discussion. Please welcome to the stage. Okay, we have heard from our three panelists this afternoon, and each panelist also giving their point of view and presentation regarding the code of conduct. And before we continue next session, we give the opportunity to Professor Kitty to give some response from the panelists.
All right.
Please.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here. First, I would like to start with two disclaimer. First, I wear the badge of ASEAN, but I do not belong to ASEAN because some person greeted me as if I was from ASEAN. So I apologize for that. I want to carry on the ASEAN spirit of solidarity. That's why I wear this pin. I bought it several years ago at ASEAN Secretariat. No one gave me that. And secondly, I am not from the field of law. I'm an international relation professor. So my perspective here is more from international relation rather than from law. What I'm trying to do here, first, I would like to discuss the point well articulated by the three speakers, which I quite agree. And another thing I would like to do is to share some Thai perspective on the issue of COC and the award, because I think I was the only representative from Thailand in this conference. I think the first speaker, Professor Liu, presented constructive models, particularly the condominium model and the Antarctic model, and some undesirable model of the handling of the South China Sea. Dr. Nguyen traced ASEAN consensus on South China Sea since 1992 and emphasized that now we are developing COC with China after past the first readings already. And I think she emphasized that we need to have some COC mechanism. If we really have COC, we need to have some follow-up mechanism. And Mr. Neil Silva, he very expert on international law. He argued that award represent the ground rules for the COC and affirmation of the EEZ, illegality of gray zone activity, and so on. I do not want to repeat because all of them have articulated very well already. But the point I would like to highlight is that all of them emphasize the linkages between the COC and UNCLOS and the UNCLOS. And there should not be some precautions in many things on third-party settlement mechanism and so on. And here I would like to spend a few minutes to share my perspective from Thailand. I would like to address 5 short questions. I promise to be short. First, what are the difference between the COC and the award? I think the award is about international law. It's a binding legal ruling under UNCLOS that set clear baselines, notably stating that historical right claim within the 9-dash line have no legal basis. The COC, on the other hand, is a political and diplomatic process. Its goal is not to settle who owns what, but to create practical rule or behavior to prevent accidents and miscalculation on the water. These two are not contradictory. They should be seen as complementary. The award provides the legal foundation while the COC tries to manage the daily reality on water. A meaningful COC cannot ignore international law. It must be built upon it. And secondly, how did Thailand respond to the 2016 ruling? As a non-claimant state, Thailand's primary interest is regional stability and ASEAN unity. Therefore, Bangkok's response was taking a path of constructive neutrality. The official statement did not use polarizing language. Instead, it emphasized a principal support for UNCLOS, the peaceful settlement of dispute, and the freedom of navigation. By staying neutral, Thailand kept its diplomatic channel open with all sides, both our ASEAN neighbor and Beijing. And accordingly, the third question, how has Thailand involved with the COC process? Thailand's neutral position allowed it to contribute practically to the COC negotiation in the past. During our year of as the ASEAN-China country coordinator from 2015 to 2018. Maritime tensions were quite high. The major breakthrough during this time was achieving the single draft negotiating text in 2018, single draft negotiating text. Before this, negotiations were stuck on abstract idea. Thailand law was to consolidate all the different competing proposals from all 11 countries into single working document. And fourth, what has Thailand been up to regarding the South China Seas or the maritime issues? The answer lies in the functional cooperation. Functional cooperation. Because the big political argument over sovereignty are gridlocked, Thailand has recently focused on functional cooperation area where countries can actually agree. Specifically, we are active on maritime environmental protection, MEP, maritime environmental protection. As the ASEAN coordinator for Sustainable Development Cooperation, Thailand linked maritime issue to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The logic is simple. While states disagree on border, they all face shared crises like dying fish stock, plastic pollution, maritime debris, and ruined coral reef. This gives everyone a neutral topic to work on together. Furthermore, we are addressing somewhat on gray zone activities. To help ASEAN address this, last year in 2025, Thailand hosted a regional seminar on the law of the sea in Bangkok alongside Japan and the European Union. This seminar brought together maritime practitioners and the experts from across ASEAN to study how to handle gray zone threat using UNCLOS. And five, what would be the way forward for us in ASEAN? I think it requires a two-tier approach. Tier 1, ASEAN must ensure that a final binding COC is strictly aligned with international law and UNCLOS. It must protect the lawful right of all states, either big or small. In Tier 2, we must expand practical and functional track. Functional cooperation like environment protection, training on gray zone challenges. When high-level politics stall, these small functional steps are what keep the pace and protect the rule-based order. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kitty, for response and valuable insight to all of us. So now we are moving into the Q&A session, and okay, oh, so excited now. Okay, the lady that smiled to me. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Aisha. I'm from a think tank called Indo-Pacific Strategic Intelligence. So my questions is, this is Dr. Neil, and you mentioned about like the points on precluding previous awards, which I completely agree. But I think even so, ASEAN and China concluded COC. There is a possibility that it remains a non-binding under international law. So what do you think is the enforcement mechanism, if any, could give the COC actual deterrent value against the gray zone incursions? Also, does the absence of dispute resolution clause potentially make the COC weaker than just the DOC that is meant to replace? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Neil. Or still another question session? Okay. Yes, the gentleman in the panel 6.
Thank you, Ristian from University of Indonesia. My question goes to Professor Liu. So I think I get your sense that we are not witnessing a rules-based order, but order-based rules. My question is, what do you think of UNCLOS? Is UNCLOS part of that order-based rules or rules-based order? Because as we understand it, UNCLOS, as previous speaker said, is a great equalizer, right? Even countries like America, like United Kingdom under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, first opposed to UNCLOS when it was adopted in 1982. So again, my question is, how do you think that UNCLOS is acting, as Professor Tomiko said, as constitution of the oceans, including the award that we are talking now. Thank you.
Okay, I give opportunity for one. So we have in the beginning 3 questions first. Okay, that lady.
Thank you. I'd like to give a question to Mr. Neil Silva. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned hard and soft measures on approaches for ASEAN South China Sea claimants. As these measures are put somewhat in isolation from one another in your table, could you elaborate more on how each of these measures work? Are there stages, for example, discussion first, assertion later, or do they work simultaneously? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Neil Silva, you may to respond.
Thank you very much for the questions, which are very hard. But in any case, okay. First of all, regarding the first question, the COC will be non-legally binding. Actually, we have to make a distinction between, number one, if the instrument itself is legally binding, and number two, if the provisions, individual provisions, are of a regulatory nature. For example, you might have a legally binding instrument, but the provisions are only vague general principles. Or it may be a legally binding instrument, but the individual provisions, instead of imposing behavior or rules, actually have a program. An example is something like the Regional Plan of Action for ASEAN, which is a non-legally binding instrument, but if it could be transformative as to programs. A better example would be the Framework Agreement on Climate Change, or even the RCEP. The RCEP, as you know, which is a merger of the ASEAN plus economic cooperation mechanisms, but if you look at the individual provisions, many of them are basically agreement to agree, right? Or even the High Seas Treaty or BBNJ Treaty. But if you look at the BBNJ Treaty, while it is a legally binding agreement, many of its provisions require later work on the financing arrangement, on the burden sharing, benefit sharing, whether monetary, non-monetary. So you might have something legally binding instrument, but the provisions themselves might be not immediately legally binding or require further work, or they are written in general terms that need to be actualized in practice by the conference of parties or by the senior officials meeting, etc. So these are things we need to distinguish. Is it legally binding in itself? And number two, are the provisions regulatory or merely programmatic? So either way, if it is legally binding, if it is legally binding, then the expectation in a decentralized international legal system is that it is the states themselves that will voluntarily comply because of the expectation, because of the fact that they view it as legally binding under the principle of pacta sunt servanda. Now, if it is not written as a legally binding instrument, then the states are still expected to comply, not as a matter of legal obligation, but as rather of political expectation. And even in that sense, it may stabilize the region. A favorite example of mine is the result of the Helsinki Conference, the Helsinki Final Act, which, as we know, was, if I remember correctly, not a legally binding treaty, but it created political expectations that helped stabilize the borders of Europe for the next few decades. So whether as legally binding instrument or as politically binding undertaking, it would be based on the character of the states seeing themselves bound by pacta sunt servanda or bound, for example, by the political expectations. Now, if there are non-compliant states, then of course that is a perennial concern in international law, and there are modes of doing so. Cooperate by socializing the relevant states who are non-compliant. Socialization is one thing, or it may be socialization linked to different forms of pressure, including diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, even as far as high up as countermeasures, for example, or even simple retortion. And these are things that exist as mechanisms under legal parlance, but also socialization mechanisms under international law. So again, will it be legally binding, or will the provisions within a legally binding instrument be regulatory? And what are the modes? Either pacta sunt servanda or again because of political expectation reinforced by the expectation among states. Now, regarding question of whether how these soft and hard means are to be put together, I would have to say that it depends on the diplomatic and political decision makers as to number one, what are their objectives, and number two, what are the interests. Sorry, what is the operating environment in which they will do this? Because number one, you could actually do it in parallel or simultaneously. You could have competition while at the same time cooperating on other modes. You can compete on borders while, for example, cooperating on the restoration of species. For example, you could have disagreement on borders, maritime borders, while at the same time implementing Part 9 of UNCLOS on the management of fisheries. They may be done simultaneously. One may be used to socialize the other. So, the example, if there is no de jure compliance, it may be that de facto cooperation will pave the way for the socialization of relevant publics, relevant elites, and relevant decision makers into a softer tone on international law. And this socialization, to quote a Chinese scholar in the Chinese Journal of International Politics, socialization goes both ways. It would be mutual socialization in order to arrive at a mutually acceptable solution, collectively acceptable. So, which one, how you do them, honestly, it really depends on the circumstances. But all I just want to point out, there's a menu. We are not limited to only one. The experience of international relations allows multiple countries to do the same. And I would like to note, by the way, the experience of Vietnam and Vietnam's very well nuanced policy, which combines both assertiveness as well as diplomatic cooperation and consultation as one example relevant to the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Neil. Now, Professor Liu, you may respond to the question.
Hello.
Thank you. Please.
Hello? Is it working? Oh, yes, working. Yes, thank you. I think that's a fantastic question. I actually organized a workshop to discuss that question 2 years ago. So let me just be very clear about this term, rules-based international order. I don't like this term because it is not an international. It is not a term in international law. It is not it has nothing to do with international law. It is invented. It was invented by certain think tanks, got quoted by certain countries' national defense strategy, spread by Western media, and then now people just start following or talking blindly. That's kind of like my point to make. Is like, I think rules-based order. So when you start talking about rules-based order, it is actually against international law because there is order there, and international law is an equalizer, as you said, right? So I think that's something I've been critical about this term for a long time. But the interesting thing is this term gives me it kind of like gives me a device, an analytical device to assess certain elements in international law and international relations. I think that's my point on the rules-based international order. And my second point on your question about the UNCLOS as a constitution for the world's oceans by famous Tommy Cole, who is also a good friend of mine. I know him for more than 20 years. So I think, to be more accurate, as an international lawyer, I would not call the UNCLOS a constitution, but I think in international law we would call it an umbrella convention. That is something I think is more accurate to describe the nature of the UNCLOS. So the UNCLOS is an umbrella convention that definitely provides the jurisdictional foundation for the global community to regulate their activities at sea. So I think that this is something that is not deniable, because it is the first time in human history that countries sit together and restructure their jurisdictional zones in the world's oceans without violence. It was done by negotiation. I think once that jurisdictional zones are set up, internal waters, territorial sea, continental shelf, EEZ, high seas, of course there are disputes, there are some kind of different interpretations, national interest, but I think the zones are there. It can be critiqued, but that's the foundation for international law to function at sea. So I would really call it an umbrella convention to be accurate. Whether it is constitution, I think that's really debatable. And as we can see, there are now two kinds of debates going on. One is, of course, from more a political kind of view. I think if you read China Institute for Maritime Affairs, they published the latest assessment on the UNCLOS report. They started criticizing this constitution for the world ocean. But there are also academic literatures working also started criticizing about this term or this to call the UNCLOS as a constitution for the world ocean. I think that comes more from a disappointment for the UNCLOS to not deal with challenges at sea, such as climate change, such as forced labors for the IUU fishing. So I think that's more. So there are different forces now coming into play to criticize whether we should call the UNCLOS a constitution for the world's oceans. But I understand where they come from. But I think I have always been calling the UNCLOS an umbrella convention for the world's oceans. That's my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liu. We still have time if anyone still want to raise a question. Yes, Dr. Okay, I read or Dr. Su, and then the gentleman behind Dr. Su.
Thank you very much for the wonderful panelists. To the wonderful panelists for the discussions. My question is particularly on DOC. So I'm not an expert on the South China Sea, but I'm just wondering because we have been discussing a lot these days about cooperation, and I wanted. My question is to all the panelists, and also one. I think mentioned about the significance of DOC itself, and then when I searched the word cooperation there, it's six times it appeared. So my question is that has there been any sort of implementation of DOC after 2002 when it was adopted? And I'm not sure. What do you think? How are you positive about finalizing COC in the near future? Or if not, then based on DOC, is there something practical that we can do to settle or to address existing challenges? Yes, thank you.
Okay, to Ms. Irene.
Hi. So the COC is ultimately an ASEAN-led consensus-based process. So it involves all the ASEAN member states, not just the claimant states. So this year, the Philippines is ASEAN chair, right? So how do how should ASEAN really, balance all the differing priorities of claimant, non-claimant members to shape negotiations? And are they making it more difficult, to reach a meaningful outcome? Because we are really at the stage where certain hard questions are being asked at the negotiation table. So Philippines, putting you on the hot seat, you are basically ASEAN chair. How do you handle that? Because different countries have different priorities. Thank you.
Excuse me, Ms. Irene, the question addressed to all panelists and
All panelists welcome to answer, but
okay. Okay, specifically to Mr. Nil Silva. Okay, and the third question, the gentleman.
Yeah, my name is Jan Peter. I address my question to all the speakers. Do you think the COC remains relevant to pursue, considering that up until today, the process has been very slow and reaching consensus for two main issues, the legally binding and the ASEAN continue to push the process through collective platform ASEAN-China. And both issues were rejected by China especially when China prefers for a direct talk instead of collective, and China reject the legally binding of the COC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. I would like to first to respond, maybe anyone, please.
So, lady first, right? Thank you very much for the questions. I try my best to answer the question you raised. First, I would like to follow up the comment on the rules by order, because last year when I joined the ASEAN dialogue on the maritime security, and I was one of the panelists in the dialogue, and the question is raised concern to the rules by order, and because I'm from the legal perspective, so I think that rules by order is quite a fictional language, and it's quite political term, because when we talk about the rules by order, the next question is who rules and which rule. So that's why I would like to prefer to use the term legal order, because it mentioned in the UNCLOS, because one of the desire to reach the UNCLOS is to maintain the legal order at sea. So my comment related to rules by order. The second for following up the question raised for the UNCLOS. UNCLOS, I think yes, it still keep the comprehensive significance, because until now it is the most comprehensive treaty which govern all matters at sea. Even now we know that the world is changing a lot, but the UNCLOS at least it identify the maritime zone, maritime entitlement, and based on that, the country have the rights and obligation to enjoy under the maritime zone, under their sovereignty, sovereign rights jurisdiction, and in the area beyond the national jurisdiction. So I think at the very beginning, the UNCLOS is still keep the value as the constitution for the law of the sea. Following up the second question, mentioned the DOC, and I think that the value, the significance of DOC is mentioned in statement by the ASEAN during the 20th anniversary of the DOC in 2022, and I think that DOC until now is the effort by the ASEAN and China to give the dedication, even if the political commitment, but to keep the situation in order. But sometimes the order is in disorder. But we cannot deny the value of DOC. And I think the DOC is, after the DOC, the party have the guidelines for implementation. But in fact, as we know that the implementation of DOC is reviewed by the GWG-DOC, the Joint Working Group DOC, under the framework between the ASEAN and China. And and for the question if the COC will be reached this year, I mentioned in my presentation that in the ASEAN statement, retreat statement from the beginning of the year, I read that carefully, and I see the deadline is within 2026. And yesterday, I think in the informal meeting between ASEAN foreign minister, the deadline is repeated again. Maybe the COC will be reached at the end of the year. This I learned from the media. And I think this year, the frequencies of the talk is pushed a lot, because we can see the frequency of the talk. And I learned from the media that there are a lot of rounds of talk under COC. And I think because the negotiation take time, so we need to believe in the negotiators. So that's why from my, because I am from the legal perspective, so I am optimist. Even there a number of questions, probably share that the 4 key points in the COC negotiation, but we need believe, estimate to the negotiation until now because we don't know what is exactly the contents in the documents. So I think I try my best to answer these questions.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen. And next, maybe Professor Liu or Mr. Neil or Prof. Kitty. Oh, yeah.
On the deadline of the COC, I'm thinking about the deadline of the RCEP. If you remember the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, I think it first aimed to be completed by 2015 or 16, but eventually it was finished under Thai chairmanship in 2019. So I'm afraid the deadline of COC might resemble what happened with the RCEP. Even RCEP is much easier compared to COC, I think. And I think some Japanese observers, some Japan scholar argue that we rather have no deal. We rather have no deal, not bad deal. So, although Japan is not involved in the process, but I think it's the thinking, something like that we have to ponder about as well. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Rim, would you like to respond?
Okay, first of all, regarding the terminology, thank you very much for the observations on the rules-based order terminology. Actually, I prefer the term normative order myself. And the reason for that is because we are bound definitely by international law, but we're also bound by a lot of non-legally binding expectations, including comity. That's why I prefer normative order myself, to make it all-encompassing of the different norms to which we are subject. Now, first of all, thank you very much for the question on the am I positive on the COC? I actually half laughed upon hearing that questions. And also, am I positive? I would say I agree with the observation that I fully in accord with the target. That being said, we need to manage our expectations of the target because again, it's a negotiation that requires consensus is necessarily a negotiation which is really reaching an acceptable compromise, acceptable to all members of the party, and basically it's a slow march to the slow march to the bottom. In terms of what is the least objectionable provision for each side, and it is something that on which I think we need to exercise some patience even amidst our frustration as to the length of time involved. And the way the published reports on the COC are, it appears to be even if it is signed soon and even if it's legally binding. In the published reports, it basically says it has common programs, management of incidents, and general principles, none of which actually have a direct effect on behavior. You are going to work together to pursue certain programs like maritime economy and maritime environment. And you will have a procedural mechanism to manage and communicate incidents to ensure that incidents, when they happen, you can immediately cooperate. And then you have some general rules concerning compliance with international norms. Now, even if it's a legally binding COC, the immediate effect on behavior is, quite frankly, based still on the good faith interpretation of these either programmatic norms or in some cases, procedural norms, because they do not seem to be regulatory norms. That's really number one. Number two, I would like to note that from my experience working with the negotiation of the peace process, internal peace processes, sometimes it is sometimes more ideal to break up the agreement into multiple agreements. For example, in our peace process in the South, we had a framework agreement or an umbrella agreement, and then sub-agreements on certain things like power sharing and wealth sharing and normalization. So perhaps to manage the expectations, we might need to fact that perhaps what eventually comes out might be a framework agreement of a kind, which is merely to agree on procedures to cooperate, and then later on, the programmatic cooperation will lead to more specific norms on cooperating on marine economy, cooperating on the marine environment, more specific norms on the formation of a technical working group on incident management, and then it'll branch off into more specific norms until you have a complex of obligations and undertakings that will then create path dependence. And that is really the best expectation, I think. Path dependence, habits of cooperation, and habits of communication that will eventually lead to an operational change in behavior, and maybe later on, a de jure change in positions. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the response, Mr. Neil. And I wouldn't use my privilege to abuse moment like the previous moderator, but I will summarize, and this is a simple summary speak. And I think that the good faith is the key word. No good faith, no progress. No good faith, we cannot get peace and stability in South China Sea. So I think that's summary from me. And thank you for your time to all panelists and discussion and all distinguished participants to share knowledge, insight, and experience to all of us here. And finally, I hope this seminar has served as a meaningful platform exchanging idea and identifying key legal and geopolitics challenges related with the South China Sea. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the participation.